The moment someone humiliates a person who cannot fight back, they reveal far more about themselves than their victim ever could. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm golden light across the grand ballroom of the Romano estate, where nearly 300 guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns gathered to celebrate what every newspaper in New York had already called the engagement of the year. String musicians filled the air with elegant melodies while servers moved gracefully between marble columns carrying silver trays topped with sparkling champagne flutes and carefully crafted hors d'oeuvres. Every corner of the ballroom reflected unimaginable wealth, from the polished Italian stone beneath polished shoes to the fresh white orchids flown in from California only hours earlier. It was the kind of evening where powerful politicians smiled beside billionaires, judges laughed with celebrities, and every conversation quietly revolved around one name: Vincent Romano. Yet among all the luxury, almost no one noticed Naomi Carter. Dressed in a perfectly pressed black and white housekeeping uniform, she moved with practiced silence, collecting empty glasses before anyone needed to ask, and straightening every tablecloth before the smallest wrinkle could remain. She had learned long ago that invisible people survived longer. At 30 years old, Naomi had spent most of her life working jobs where being overlooked was considered success. She never interrupted conversations. She never searched for attention. She simply worked with quiet dignity, believing that respect was something you earned through character rather than status. Tonight was only her third week inside the Romano estate, and she reminded herself every few minutes that this event was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Every guest seemed wealthier than the last. Every smile carefully rehearsed, every compliment hiding another calculation. Standing near the center of it all was Charlotte Whitmore, Vincent Romano's fiancée, wearing a custom ivory evening gown that shimmered beneath the ballroom lights like flowing silk. She greeted every guest with flawless elegance, but behind every polished smile hid an unmistakable hunger to establish herself as the future queen of the Romano household. Her eyes constantly searched the room, not for friends, but for opportunities to remind everyone exactly where they belonged. When she noticed Naomi quietly replacing a folded linen napkin near the head table, Charlotte's expression barely changed, yet something cold settled behind her smile. She watched the young maid for several silent seconds before deliberately lifting a crystal champagne flute from the table and taking 2 slow steps closer. Around them, conversations continued without interruption, laughter echoed across the ballroom, and cameras flashed as influential guests documented another glamorous moment. Naomi finished adjusting the place, setting, and respectfully stepped backward, lowering her eyes as she prepared to continue toward the kitchen. She never saw Charlotte subtly angle the champagne glass toward the edge of the table. One gentle movement was all it took. The crystal tipped, the pale champagne spilled across expensive fabric, and a sharp gasp cut through the music. Every nearby conversation stopped at once as dozens of heads turned toward the sound. Charlotte looked down at the stain on her gown before slowly raising her eyes toward Naomi, whose face reflected nothing but stunned confusion. For one impossibly long heartbeat, the ballroom became so quiet that even the musicians hesitated. Then Charlotte took one measured step forward, her voice carrying clearly enough for every guest nearby to hear. "How careless of you." Naomi blinked in confusion, instinctively looking at the overturned crystal flute before glancing at the pale stain spreading across the expensive fabric. She had been standing nearly 2 feet away when it happened, yet every pair of eyes seemed to accept Charlotte's accusation without question. Years of experience had taught Naomi that truth often arrived too late for people in uniforms like hers. She lowered her head respectfully and spoke with a calm voice that barely rose above the silence surrounding them. "I am very sorry if I caused any inconvenience, ma'am. Please allow me to help clean it immediately." Instead of easing the tension, her humility appeared to encourage it. Charlotte let out a quiet laugh that carried just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. "Help?" she repeated with polished disbelief. "Some mistakes cannot be cleaned away." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared among the guests, while others exchanged uncertain glances, unwilling to challenge the future Mrs. Romano during the most prestigious celebration of the season. Naomi bent carefully to retrieve the fallen glass, making certain no shards remained on the polished marble floor. Her movements stayed precise despite the growing weight of hundreds of curious eyes. She refused to rush because panic only invited more criticism. Deep inside, however, she could already feel the familiar ache that had followed her through countless jobs where assumptions always arrived before fairness. It reminded her of her mother, who had cleaned office buildings for nearly 30 years and often said that dignity was the only possession no employer could truly take away unless you surrendered it yourself. Naomi silently repeated those words as she placed the broken crystal onto a serving tray. Across the ballroom, several members of the household staff watched anxiously from behind the dessert station. They knew Naomi well enough to understand she would never behave carelessly. During the past 3 weeks, she had quietly stayed after every shift to help an elderly dishwasher finish lifting heavy racks into storage. She had repaired a torn uniform for a young server who could not afford a replacement. She had even spent her own lunch break reading medication instructions to one of the older gardeners whose eyesight had begun to fail. None of those acts had been performed for recognition. In fact, almost no one knew they had happened at all. That was simply the kind of person Naomi Carter had always chosen to be. Charlotte, however, saw only a servant standing beneath her social position. She straightened her shoulders as several influential guests gathered closer, sensing that an unexpected drama was unfolding. Cameras that moments earlier had been capturing elegant decorations now pointed discreetly toward the growing circle surrounding the head table. The musicians slowed until the final violin note dissolved into complete silence. Naomi remained composed, her hands folded neatly before her apron, refusing to argue even though every instinct urged her to defend herself. She understood that words spoken in anger rarely changed proud minds. Yet the quiet confidence in her eyes seemed to irritate Charlotte even more than an apology would have. For the first time that evening, the celebration no longer revolved around luxury or romance. It revolved around a single invisible line separating those who believed status defined human worth from the woman who continued standing with grace despite being judged before anyone had bothered to learn the truth. Charlotte allowed the silence to linger, knowing every extra second placed more pressure on the woman standing before her. She slowly brushed a hand across the front of her gown, examining the pale stain as though it represented a personal insult rather than a minor accident. Then she smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Do you know how much this dress costs?" she asked loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Naomi remained composed, meeting the question with respectful honesty. "No, ma'am." Charlotte gave a soft, dismissive laugh. "Of course you do not." A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked away, pretending to admire the floral arrangements instead of witnessing the growing humiliation unfolding only a few feet away. The atmosphere that had been filled with celebration only moments earlier now carried an uncomfortable stillness, as though everyone sensed they were watching something that should never have happened, yet no one possessed the courage to interrupt it. Naomi quietly reached for a fresh linen cloth from a nearby serving station. "If you will allow me, I can have this cleaned immediately," she offered. Charlotte stepped back before Naomi could come closer. "Do not touch me." Her voice remained perfectly controlled, which somehow made every word sound even colder. People should know their place before they try to fix problems they create. Those words spread through the ballroom faster than any whisper. Several guests shifted awkwardly, while a few younger executives forced polite smiles, uncertain whether remaining silent was loyalty or cowardice. Near the rear of the ballroom, members of the household staff stood frozen. They wanted to help Naomi, but years of working around powerful families had taught them that interfering in personal conflicts between employers could cost them everything. Naomi understood their hesitation. She did not blame them. She simply folded the unused cloth in her hands and lowered her eyes once again. Her heartbeat had grown heavier, but her voice remained steady. "I have always tried to perform my duties with care. I would never intentionally damage your belongings." Charlotte tilted her head with theatrical disappointment. Intentions do not erase incompetence. The remark drew a few restrained chuckles from guests who seemed more interested in pleasing Charlotte than protecting fairness. Naomi felt each laugh settle quietly inside her heart, not because it wounded her pride, but because it reminded her how easily dignity could be questioned when someone wore an apron instead of an evening gown. She thought about the long hours she had worked since arriving at the Romano estate, polishing floors before sunrise, helping prepare banquets that she would never attend, making certain every room reflected perfection long before the first guest ever arrived. None of those efforts seemed to matter now. In the eyes of many watching, she had already become the story they preferred to believe. Charlotte glanced around the ballroom, recognizing that the attention of nearly every guest now rested entirely upon her. Confidence settled across her face. She believed she controlled the room, the narrative, and the outcome. What she failed to notice was the subtle change spreading among the security staff positioned near the grand entrance. Their posture straightened almost simultaneously. Conversations near the doorway faded. Without a single announcement, several distinguished guests instinctively turned toward the entrance as polished black dress shoes echoed softly across the marble floor. The most powerful man in the room had just arrived, and although Charlotte continued speaking, convinced the evening still belonged to her, the balance of power had already begun to change. Vincent Romano entered the ballroom without ceremony, yet the atmosphere shifted the instant he crossed the threshold. Conversations faded into whispers, musicians lowered their instruments, and even veteran business leaders instinctively stepped aside as he walked across the polished marble floor with measured confidence. His tailored black suit reflected none of the extravagance surrounding him. The true weight he carried came from something far less visible: respect. Every person in the room knew that Vincent rarely raised his voice because he had never needed to. Charlotte noticed him immediately, and relief softened her expression. She assumed his arrival meant the uncomfortable moment would finally end in her favor. She offered a graceful smile, expecting him to approach her first. Instead, Vincent's eyes traveled quietly across the room, taking in every detail without speaking. He noticed the broken crystal resting on the silver tray. He noticed the stain on Charlotte's gown. Most importantly, he noticed Naomi standing perfectly still with folded hands and lowered eyes, making no attempt to defend herself or accuse anyone else. His expression remained unreadable. Charlotte stepped toward him with effortless confidence. "Vincent, this maid ruined my dress in front of everyone," she said, gesturing toward Naomi as though the conclusion required no further discussion. "I believe the staff should receive better training before important events like this." Vincent did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Naomi for another brief moment before returning to Charlotte. The silence stretched across the ballroom until it became almost unbearable. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for the powerful host to settle the matter with a simple command. Charlotte mistook his silence for agreement. She turned back toward Naomi with renewed certainty. "You should apologize properly," she said. "Perhaps then everyone can move on with the evening." Naomi lifted her eyes just enough to speak respectfully. "I am deeply sorry that your evening has been disturbed, ma'am. It was never my intention." There was no anger in her voice, no resentment, only quiet sincerity. Somehow, that calm response seemed to irritate Charlotte even more. "Your intention is irrelevant," she replied sharply. "Results are what matter." Before anyone could react, Charlotte closed the remaining distance between them and struck Naomi across the face with an open hand. The sound was not loud, yet inside the silent ballroom it seemed to echo far longer than anyone expected. Naomi's head turned slightly from the impact, but she neither cried out nor stepped backward. She slowly returned her gaze forward, one hand resting lightly against her cheek as she struggled only to maintain her composure. A wave of shock swept through the guests. Several women covered their mouths. One elderly judge quietly lowered his eyes. A young server nearly dropped the tray he was carrying. No one moved. No one spoke. Every person waited for Vincent Romano. Charlotte stood perfectly still, convinced she had demonstrated authority worthy of becoming the lady of the Romano household. Instead, Vincent looked neither at her hand nor at the faint mark left upon Naomi's face. He simply studied the woman who had remained respectful through every insult without surrendering her dignity. Then, in a voice so calm that it chilled the entire ballroom more effectively than anger ever could, he asked a single question. "Who gave you permission to treat another human being that way?" Charlotte opened her mouth to answer, but the certainty that had carried her through the evening suddenly faltered. Vincent never raised his voice, never pointed a finger, and never displayed the kind of temper people expected from powerful men. That quiet question carried far more weight than shouting ever could. The ballroom remained perfectly still as every guest waited for someone to speak. Charlotte forced a polite smile and straightened her shoulders. "Vincent, you are misunderstanding what happened. She damaged my gown in front of everyone. I simply expected professionalism." Vincent listened without interruption, his expression unchanged. Then he looked toward Naomi. "Did you damage the dress intentionally?" Naomi met his eyes for the first time since he had entered the room. "No, sir," she answered honestly. "I would never intentionally damage anyone's property. I only wanted to do my job well." Her voice remained calm despite everything that had happened. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not accuse Charlotte. She simply answered the question she had been asked. Vincent gave a slight nod before turning toward the nearby staff members. Who was serving this section? A young waiter hesitated, clearly nervous about speaking in front of so many influential guests. Before he could answer, Charlotte stepped forward. "Surely this does not require an investigation. It was an unfortunate mistake, and we should move on." Vincent looked at her with the same measured calm. "If we are going to move on, we will do so with the truth." Those words settled heavily over the room. The young waiter finally found the courage to speak. "Sir, I was standing only a few feet away. Miss Carter did not touch the glass. It tipped after Miss Whitmore moved closer to the table." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Charlotte immediately shook her head. "That is ridiculous. He must have been mistaken." Vincent neither accepted nor rejected either version. Instead, he motioned toward the head of security, a white former police captain who had supervised the estate for years. "Mr. Reynolds," Vincent said evenly, "please preserve the ballroom security footage before anyone leaves." The experienced officer nodded immediately and spoke into his radio without hesitation. The confidence that had defined Charlotte's posture slowly began to fade. For the first time that evening, she realized the conversation was no longer under her control. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing, saying nothing more than necessary. She quietly thanked the waiter with a gentle glance, but she did not celebrate his words. She understood that honesty required patience. Several guests who had laughed only minutes earlier now avoided looking in her direction. Others began replaying the scene in their own minds, wondering whether they had judged too quickly simply because one woman wore an elegant gown while the other wore a housekeeping uniform. Vincent noticed those changing expressions, but his attention soon returned to Naomi. What impressed him was not that she claimed innocence. It was that even after being publicly embarrassed, she had shown every person in the room more self-control than anyone else. In that moment, the expensive decorations, the famous guests, and the carefully planned celebration seemed strangely unimportant. Character had become the most valuable thing in the ballroom, and only one person had displayed it without asking for recognition. Less than 10 minutes later, Mr. Reynolds returned with a small tablet connected to the estate security system. No one reached for another glass of champagne. No one resumed their conversations. The celebration had quietly transformed into something entirely different. Vincent accepted the device without a word and reviewed the recording himself before handing it to Mr. Reynolds. "Display it," he said calmly. A large screen that had been prepared for the evening's family photographs came to life. Guests watched in complete silence as the security footage replayed the moments leading to the incident from above. The camera clearly showed Naomi adjusting the table setting before stepping backward. It showed Charlotte approaching the table, lifting her own champagne flute, and shifting close enough that the glass tipped from the edge after her movement. There was no contact from Naomi, no careless gesture, no mistake on her part. Only an unfortunate chain of events followed immediately by an accusation that never should have been made. The recording continued for several more seconds, revealing Naomi lowering her head respectfully and offering to help, while Charlotte rejected every attempt with visible disdain. When the video ended, the ballroom remained so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard above the silence. Several guests slowly lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncomfortable looks with the people standing beside them. The laughter that had echoed through the room earlier now felt painfully distant. Charlotte stared at the blank screen, searching for an explanation that would restore the confidence she had displayed only moments before. "The camera does not show everything," she said at last, forcing composure into her voice. She was still responsible for disrupting the evening. Vincent looked toward her without anger. Responsibility begins with honesty, he replied. Tonight, honesty has spoken for itself. Before Charlotte could answer, an elderly woman from the kitchen staff stepped forward unexpectedly. She had worked for the Romano family for more than 25 years and rarely addressed guests directly. Her hands trembled slightly, yet her voice remained clear. Sir, if I may. Vincent gave a respectful nod. Go ahead. She turned toward the gathering with quiet dignity. Miss Carter has helped every department since the day she arrived. Last week she stayed nearly 2 extra hours after her shift because one of our cooks became ill. She never asked for overtime. She simply said that no one should have to finish difficult work alone. Another employee found the courage to speak. Then another. A young groundskeeper described how Naomi had brought him lunch when he had been working through the rain. A housekeeper explained that Naomi quietly repaired damaged uniforms with her own sewing kit instead of throwing them away. None of them spoke dramatically. They simply described ordinary acts of kindness that had gone unnoticed because Naomi had never expected recognition. Vincent listened carefully to every word. Charlotte listened as well, but with growing disbelief. She had spent the evening measuring people by titles, clothing, and social standing. Now the room was measuring someone by character instead. Naomi looked visibly uncomfortable as the praise continued. Please, she said softly. Everyone has been very kind to me. There is no need to make this about me. Her response only deepened the silence. Even after being publicly embarrassed, she still refused to seek attention or revenge. In that moment, many guests realized they had witnessed 2 very different definitions of strength. One relied upon status. The other required nothing except grace, humility, and the quiet courage to remain respectful when respect had not been given in return. Vincent allowed another long silence to settle over the ballroom before taking a slow step toward Charlotte. There was no anger on his face, only disappointment that seemed far heavier than outrage could ever become. Every guest watched carefully, realizing they were witnessing a decision that would be remembered long after the music had faded and the flowers had been removed. Charlotte searched his expression for reassurance, convinced that years of planning their future together would outweigh one terrible moment. Vincent, she said quietly, everyone makes mistakes. This has become much larger than it needed to be. Vincent answered without hesitation. The spilled champagne was a mistake. Everything that happened afterward was a choice. Those words echoed through the room with unmistakable clarity. Charlotte's confidence finally began to disappear. I was trying to protect my dignity, she insisted. Vincent slowly shook his head. No, you tried to protect your pride by taking someone else's dignity away. The distinction settled heavily upon everyone listening. Several guests lowered their eyes, recognizing that they had remained silent when their voices might have mattered. Vincent reached calmly into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the small velvet box that contained the engagement ring he had presented months earlier. He held it for only a moment before closing the lid. Charlotte stared at the familiar box, suddenly understanding what was about to happen. Please do not do this here, she whispered. Vincent looked at her with genuine sadness rather than resentment. If someone can publicly embarrass an innocent person, then accountability should never be hidden behind closed doors. He carefully took Charlotte's hand, removed the engagement ring without force or hostility, and placed it back inside the velvet box. The simple movement carried more finality than any dramatic speech could have delivered. An audible gasp spread across the ballroom. No one had expected the evening to change so completely. Vincent turned toward the gathered guests, his voice remaining steady and respectful. Tonight was meant to celebrate a future built upon trust, integrity, and mutual respect. Those values cannot exist where another person's humanity is treated as something less important than social status. Therefore, there will be no wedding. The announcement settled over the room like complete silence after a storm. Charlotte stood motionless, unable to believe that the celebration she had dreamed about had ended with a lesson she had never expected to receive. Vincent did not insult her. He did not embarrass her further. He simply entrusted the velvet box to Mr. Reynolds and added, "Please make certain Miss Whitmore's transportation home is arranged with every courtesy." Even now, he refused to answer humiliation with humiliation. That choice did not go unnoticed. Guests who had admired Vincent for his influence now admired something far greater. They witnessed a man choosing principle over convenience, fairness over appearance, and character over public image. Naomi remained quietly near the edge of the ballroom, visibly overwhelmed by everything unfolding around her. She had never wanted anyone to lose a relationship because of her. She had only wanted the truth to matter. Vincent looked toward her briefly before addressing the room one final time. Power is measured by how we treat people who have nothing to offer us except their honesty. Tonight, only one person in this ballroom demonstrated that kind of strength from the very beginning, and it was not the person standing beneath the brightest lights. No one rushed toward the exits. No one reached for another drink. The grand ballroom, which had been designed to celebrate wealth and prestige, had become a place where every person quietly examined the values they carried into the room. Charlotte accepted the escort offered by Mr. Reynolds without protest. Her shoulders remained straight, but the confidence that had once surrounded her had disappeared beneath the weight of reflection. As the doors closed behind her, the silence she left behind felt strangely peaceful. Vincent turned his attention away from the departing guests and walked toward Naomi. She instinctively took a small step backward, uncomfortable with becoming the center of attention. "Sir," she said gently, "I never wanted any of this to happen. I am truly sorry your evening ended this way." Vincent stopped a respectful distance from her and shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for." His voice carried through the ballroom with quiet sincerity. "The person who protected dignity tonight was you." Naomi lowered her eyes once more. She had spent years believing that the best employees were the ones no one remembered. Standing before hundreds of influential strangers was the last place she ever wished to be. Vincent noticed her discomfort and addressed the gathering instead. "Many of you know my family. Many of you have done business with me for years. But tonight I learned something about one member of my household that I should have learned much sooner." He looked toward the staff standing together near the back of the room. "You spoke honestly about Miss Carter because you trusted her character. I would like everyone else to understand why." The elderly kitchen supervisor smiled warmly through tearful eyes. "She reminds people that kindness does not require permission," she said softly. Another employee nodded. "When my son was in the hospital, she quietly collected donations from the staff without ever telling me who organized them." A housekeeper added, "She always finished her own work before helping the rest of us with ours." Naomi looked genuinely surprised. She had never imagined that the small acts she considered ordinary had been noticed at all. "Please," she whispered. "Anyone here would have done the same." The older woman smiled gently. "Perhaps, but you were the one who actually did." Several guests who had remained silent throughout the evening slowly began to applaud. The sound started with only 2 or 3 people before spreading across the ballroom until nearly everyone joined. It was not loud or theatrical. It was steady, respectful, and deeply sincere. Naomi looked overwhelmed, uncertain how to respond to recognition she had never sought. Vincent waited for the applause to fade before speaking again. "Miss Carter, if you are willing, I would consider it an honor if you joined us at the head table for the remainder of the evening, not as someone serving this event, but as someone we should all be proud to know." Naomi hesitated, glancing toward her fellow employees before answering with the same humility that had guided every choice she had made since arriving at the estate. "Thank you, sir. I would rather stay beside my team. They are the reason I have felt welcome here from my first day." Vincent smiled for the first time that evening. It was a quiet smile, born not from victory, but from admiration. In that simple answer, everyone present witnessed the same truth once again. Some people earn respect by demanding it. Others receive it naturally because they spend every ordinary day giving it away. The guests remained in the ballroom long after the orchestra quietly resumed playing. Yet the evening no longer revolved around elegance or influence. Instead, conversations drifted toward a single lesson that no speech had been intended to teach. One by one, respected judges, business executives, community leaders, and longtime family friends crossed the room to thank the household staff before leaving the estate. Many of them paused to shake Naomi Carter's hand, not because she had become famous overnight, but because they realized they had nearly overlooked someone whose character deserved their respect from the very beginning. Naomi accepted every kind word with the same gentle smile, insisting that she had simply done the job she had been hired to do. Before the final guests departed, Vincent Romano gathered every employee in the ballroom, from the executive chef to the newest dishwasher, from the gardeners to the housekeeping team. They stood together beneath the crystal chandeliers, uncertain why they had been called forward. Vincent looked at each familiar face before speaking. This estate has never been built by one family alone. It has been built every single day by people whose names rarely appear in newspapers, but whose work allows everything else to exist. Tonight reminded me that leadership means protecting the dignity of every person who walks through these doors. He turned toward Naomi with quiet gratitude. Miss Carter, you reminded all of us that integrity does not become greater when it is noticed. It remains the same whether anyone is watching or not. Naomi lowered her head modestly. Thank you, sir. My mother always told me that every person deserves to be greeted with respect because you never know what burdens they are carrying. Vincent nodded thoughtfully. Your mother raised an extraordinary daughter. A gentle smile appeared across Naomi's face, the first completely relaxed smile anyone had seen from her that evening. Outside, the lights of New York shimmered against the night sky as the last luxury cars disappeared beyond the estate gates. Inside, the staff quietly returned the ballroom to order, folding linens, clearing tables, and gathering flowers exactly as they had done after countless other events. Yet something invisible had changed. The younger employees worked with renewed confidence. The senior staff carried themselves with a little more pride. Even the guests who had witnessed the evening would leave with a story that had nothing to do with wealth or prestige. Weeks later, people still spoke about the engagement that never became a wedding, but not because it ended unexpectedly. They remembered it because one quiet woman refused to surrender her kindness when she had every reason to become bitter, and because one powerful man proved that true authority begins with accountability rather than privilege. As for Naomi, she arrived at work the very next morning before sunrise, wearing the same neatly pressed uniform, greeting every co-worker with the same warm smile, and returning to the ordinary acts of service that had always defined her. She did not believe one remarkable evening had made her extraordinary. She believed every ordinary day offered another opportunity to treat people with compassion. Vincent watched her from the balcony for a brief moment before turning back toward the responsibilities waiting inside his office. He understood that fortunes could be earned, reputations could be rebuilt, and celebrations could always be planned again, but genuine dignity could never be purchased. And on that unforgettable night, everyone who had entered the ballroom seeking luxury walked away remembering something far more valuable. They remembered what dignity truly looks like.